If you explore the Kootenay backcountry, at some point you're bound to encounter a long-abandoned, dilapidated cabin in the woods. There must be hundreds, maybe even thousands of these cabins throughout the basin, sometimes in the most obscure places. My own personal favorite is a well-made axe-hewn log structure that barely sleeps two, hidden in the woods above one of our favorite boat camping spots. Not a road in sight. When you approach, you'll see the roof is partially caved in and the door is barely hanging on. There might be an old rusty bed frame or remnants of a wood stove, some rusty cans, maybe a dirt-filled beer bottle. Signs of rodents cover every surface. I used to take my kids into the old silver-gray lichen-covered structure above the lake, and we would sit there and try to imagine its story. Who built it? Why? Were they miners, hunters, outlaws even? You could call them ghost stories, I suppose. It doesn't take much for the imagination to run wild when you happen upon an old cabin in the woods. As settlers began moving into the basin during the mid to late 1880s, lured primarily to the riches buried in the ground, solitary cabins quickly multiplied, growing into small communities and then booming resource towns, almost overnight. But as quickly as they were built, they were abandoned. Mining was on the decline in the early 1900s. And then other factors, like young men being called away to fight in World War I, and the mining rush began to evaporate. Their stories, though, well, they live on. Some are just too good to forget. I'm Mitchell Scott, Editor-in-Chief of Kootenay Mountain Culture Productions, and this is The Headwaters, brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. On this podcast, we're going to look at ghost towns in the Columbia Basin. The region is home to an astonishing number of them. Many were thriving cities that quickly reverted to wilderness. Others drowned due to dam construction. There were whole communities that disappeared from the map. Plus a few that even managed to come back from the dead. We're going to start with the very first actual town in the Columbia Basin, a place called Fisherville. Historian and Kootenay Mountain Culture correspondent Greg Nestoroff is here to tell us all about it. Greg, where was Fisherville? I'm imagining it's got to be on a river with fairly good fishing.
Well, Fisherville was in the East Kootenay on Wild Horse Creek. It's about 6 or 7 kilometers northeast of another ghost town, Fort Steele. I'm not sure about the fishing, though.
It's got to be good. Okay, Fort Steele, a fairly iconic ghost town museum of sorts, much like Barkerville near Quesnel, which I visited when I was a little kid. But I'm interested in knowing what era are we talking about here?
Well, gold rush began there in 1863 when flakes or nuggets were discovered at the mouth of the creek. So this is 4 years before Canada becomes a country. It's not the first gold rush in the BC interior, but it is the first in the Kootenays.
And as you say, this is the first official town in the Kootenays. How long did it last and how many people lived there?
Only a few years, but in that time at least a few hundred prospectors showed up, mainly from south of the border, to test their fortunes panning for gold. And the town was named after one of them, Jack Fisher.
Oh, so the fishing might not have been so good.
Jack Fisher is also the namesake of Mount Fisher, the iconic peak near Cranbrook. Author-historian Keith Powell says Fisherville was a big enough deal that a trade route was built to serve it.
And of course it was the gold rush of the Wild Horse that really opened up the area, because that was prompted the provincial government at that time, territorial government, to consider building the Dewdney Trail. So they hired Edgar Dewdney to extend the trail. It had, I think, gone as far as the Okanagan, and they wanted it to come into the interior, because what was happening was you had all these American prospectors, miners, and they were taking their gold directly down into the States. So Canada wasn't even getting any tariff or revenue out of it.
The government had to take its cut, I guess. If I'm correct, I think the Dewdney Trail was over 700 kilometers long and started around Hope. Is that right, Greg?
Yeah, that's right.
Finished in Fisherville, as you're saying, connecting all sorts of British Columbia small towns and mining camps along the way. So what was Fisherville like?
Well, it had one main street and a couple of general stores, and they struggled to keep up with the demand so that they could charge, well, really whatever they wanted. It had a bunch of saloons that were stocked by a local brewery, and according to Keith Powell, it was pretty rough around the edges.
There was a gunfight in Fisherville, resulted in the death of a guy named Tommy Walker. He was from Ireland. Interesting story as well. There's a book to be written about Tommy Walker. His father came to North America and searched for him for 20 years and never did find out whatever happened to him. But he lays, there's a marked grave in Fisherville. He was gunned down in a gunfight on the banks of Fisherville.
Yikes, that sounds nasty.
Yeah, and after that, a constable was appointed and a jail was built to help maintain order. But Keith says before long, things mostly calmed down.
So that was sort of the first phase. So as most gold rushes, miners, prospectors came in, took the easy gold. They left. So it sort of then went dormant for a while, and then the Chinese came in late 1800s, 1880s, 1890, and they started hydraulic mining and basically took the wild horse down to bedrock and did a tremendous amount of excavating and prospecting and hydraulic mining.
But as for the town itself, it was eaten up by new mining discoveries.
Ironically, they did find gold under the town, and they burned most of the town down to get the gold. But it was rebuilt, and it was known as Kootenay, and it was the official designation of governmental offices and so forth for many years until it moved down into Fort Steele. And so there was quite a development up in Fisherville. But if you walk through it today, you can still see remnants of what is there.
So if we were going to take a trip to Fisherville today, what would we see?
For that, we're going to turn to Jason Jacob, a prospector who's also president of the East Kootenay Chamber of Mines based in Cranbrook.
Okay, so we're just coming into the old town site of Fisherville here. This was a small community. There was mostly cabins and tents, so there wasn't a lot of main structures. The original post office was just down the road here to the left-hand side, and I'll show you where the actual rock work is.
Jason knows this area well. He placer mined here from 1984 until 2013.
Yeah, there's always gold here, so there's always people that are trying to find it. Yeah. There was some larger companies that took over after we left, and we ran large operations up until we left. They took over, and now it's just mostly smaller operations. So a couple, three, maybe 2-3 guys that are working with small deposits, trying to see what they can find. Yeah, there's still channels that can be developed. It's just with a small budget, it's hard to get at them because they do get deep. So you need larger money to find those larger deposits that are deeper in the channel gravels.
So that's the mining side of it. Are there any buildings left? I mean, we are talking about ghost towns. Is there anything left?
No, but Jason points us to the site of the last cabin.
Ah, the lone cabin in the woods.
Right beside where the post office was, there was a cabin, a small, basically built probably in the 30s, late 30s and 40s. And it was just basically made out of shake wood and bits and pieces of slab wood. Just had the door, roof, and 4 windows on it. So it was just a mining cabin. And now, of course, it's just piles of wood now. That would have been the last cabin that was standing here. There's nothing else. You can find bits and pieces of wood here and there.
Does Fisherville have any official heritage status today?
Yes, although it took a long time to get it. The East Kootenay Historical Society started pushing for it in the late 1950s, but it wasn't until 1996 that it finally became the Wild Horse Creek Historic Site. So it has signage and an interpretive trail, You can see the remains of an old apple orchard, plus what's left of the Dewdney Trail and some old mine workings.
Wow, sounds like a very interesting place. Was Fisherville the only town in the area at the time?
There were a few others that appeared on its heels. One was called Tonyville, which was famous for its brothels.
Not for the number of Tonys.
I don't think so, no. There was another camp called Wild Horse, and there was a place named after prospector John Galbraith. Now, he realized there was a better business opportunity than panning for gold. He ran a ferry across the Kootenay River and reportedly charged $1 per person and $2 per horse on the way in.
Entrepreneurial.
Yes, and on the way out, it was $5 a person and $10 a horse.
Very entrepreneurial.
And the crossing was called Galbraith's Ferry. But today you know it as Fort Steele.
So why the name change?
Well, in the 1880s, a Ktunaxa man was arrested for murder, and Northwest Mounted Police Superintendent Sam Steele was sent with officers to calm tensions. At least that's the settler version of the story. The Ktunaxa say he was really there to enforce their confinement to reserves. Regardless, Steele didn't stay long, but the area was named after him.
Well, it's kind of sounding like the Wild Wild West back then. I imagine they built a fort, hence Fort Steele?
Not an actual fort, but it was a police compound that kind of looked like one. And then for a few years in the 1890s, the town thrived in the wake of new mining discoveries. But when the railway bypassed it in favor of Cranbrook, Fort Steele began a long, slow decline.
But Fort Steele is still there today.
Well, because it was the first Northwest Mounted Police post in BC, it was designated a National Historic Site in the 1920s. And then in 1961, the provincial government bought it and turned it into a heritage park that's open year-round. And today, as you say, it's a popular tourist attraction. And you know, one interesting way to explore Fort Steele is by horse-drawn wagon.
And I can grab your tickets there, too. I have one. Perfect. Come on up. Anybody else coming for a ride? Sounds good. All right, so welcome aboard, everybody. My name is Mags, and as you know, we got Cody up front there, and Cody's our teamster. And the horses that we're using today, we have Bonnie on the left-hand side, and Blaze is on the right-hand side. So there are 5-year-old Black Clydesdales, and whenever Cody is ready, we'll get going. There might be a little bit of a lurch as we get going, okay? So just keep your mums on your seats. There it is. All right. Wow. And away we go.
The tour takes you around town and gives you a feel of what it was like when horses and donkeys were the main way to get around. Fort Steele has 10 horses, but they aren't the only livestock.
And this is where we house most of our chickens, or our poultry anyways. We've got some ducks in here too. And the breeds that we have are heritage breeds, so all of the animals at Fort Steele are heritage breeds, so something that would have been around in the 1800s.
On top of heritage breeds, there are plenty of heritage buildings.
There's about, let's say, 30 buildings that are original on their original locations. Another, say, 30 that are original but were moved to their current locations. And then several other buildings that are representative of the time frame in these Kootenays but are not from Fort Steele itself. And then several replicas or special built for the park, like the Wild Horse Theatre is special built for the park. And the water tower is a replica of what would have stood where the water wheel sits today.
There are also signs of the earlier gold rush.
And so we're coming up to some of the oldest buildings in town. The very oldest building that we have is John Galbraith's cabin, and it's up ahead on the right side. There's a gentleman just coming down off the steps there, and that was built in 1864 by Mr. John Galbraith. So that was his ferry office, and he did have his home in the back there. Pretty incredible that thing's still standing, considering he really didn't plan on sticking around here for that long.
For Mags, life in an almost but not quite ghost town has a lot going for it.
But for us today, we get the view, we've got all the heritage buildings, we get to keep the animals here. There's no suburbs, there's no Walmarts. It's beautiful. And that is the end of the tour. Thank you for coming out, everyone.
What a fascinating trip to two of the basin's most famous ghost towns. But we couldn't very well do an episode on the subject without heading to the legendary Silvery Slocan. Greg Nesteroff takes us to a region that once teemed with commerce and activity.
Have you heard of the Valley of the Ghosts? It's the stretch of Highway 31A between Caslow and New Denver. It's dotted with old mines and remnants of towns that no longer exist. There were about 10 of these communities, from Alamo to Zinkton, most with their own hotels, saloons, and stores. They all lived and died with the price of silver, lead, and zinc. But one of them stands out. 8 kilometers east of New Denver, you turn onto a well-traveled gravel road. Another 6 kilometers brings you to one of BC's best-known ghost towns, Sandon. That Sandon ever existed at all is a bit of a miracle because you could hardly imagine a worse place for a town. The mountains are steep, the valley's narrow, and there's a raging creek running right through the middle of the settlement. In fact, the town's main street was built on top of that creek in the 1890s. That was also Sandon's undoing. A washout in the 1950s destroyed the flume and undermined many buildings. It would have been a safe bet Sandon was finished. Against all odds, though, Sandon became a heritage tourist attraction. Today you can tour a museum in the old general store, visit the former city hall, and see the workings of the hydroelectric plant that's been going for more than a century. A handful of people make Sandon their year-round home. Some have been here for decades, others are more recent arrivals.
Hello, come on in. I'm John. Welcome to Molly Brown's. Welcome to Sandon.
John Wilson lives in, well, an unusual house.
Historic. This is the Molly Brown's brothel. So, this whole bottom area is the red light district here. This has changed a lot since it was a brothel. This house in 1995, it got rebuilt by three couples out of New Denver there.
John is originally from Dawson Creek and bought this small wooden building on a bit of a whim while visiting the area a decade ago.
Oh, well, I love mostly the backcountry, right? And I love history. I'm a history guy. And I've always been, like I said, intrigued with Sandon. So that was a big draw. And when I moved down here, I wanted kind of a private area.
He says he's always been a rural person, so living in a ghost town is an easy fit for him. But there are some drawbacks about this particular spot.
I love we're 3,500 feet elevation, way up. I love it. The worst part for me is we lose the sun for 3 months. Early November, I just get a tiny bit of sun and then I lose it. And then it's not till the second week of February I get it back. It starts peeking over the mountain, and even for a few minutes, it feels good at first.
Besides the sun, he lacks one other thing. Sandon has an historic hydroelectric plant. The silversmith is well positioned to achieve records for the world's longest continuously operating machinery. John is not one of its customers.
Well, yeah, so I'm totally off grid. I'm the only resident in Sandon that has no power. So I got a little Mickey Mouse solar thing, and then when I need it, I got the generator and all that. And I don't mind the lamps and stuff in the winter.
But he doesn't see himself as a recluse.
I tour people around and stuff, and yeah, I give people extra at the museum if they want it. So I like my space, but I love people too. So I'm not your typical recluse.
John Wilson isn't the only person in recent years to make Sandon their permanent home. Vita Turok's introduction was unique. Most people drive into town on the valley floor, and if they're feeling adventurous, might follow a winding road up to the Idaho Peak trailhead. Instead, Vita descended into Sandon from Idaho Peak on foot.
My story is pretty epic. I left the island in 2016 with planning. I was planning a trip, an adventure, and I lived out of a backpack for 100 days, and I just started hiking and walking all of southwestern BC, and I came up to Sandon by fluke. I had no ambitions of coming up this far, and I hiked up Idaho Peak, but from Silverton side, came up and then came down the other side into Sandon, and from the 9K point on the Idaho FSR, you look straight down into Sandon, and I just right then and there knew this was going to be my home. I was going to work, live, and play here. And literally 2 months, not even 2 months later, I moved here August the 16th, 2016, and been here ever since.
Vida now runs a cafe at Sandon.
We call it the 14th Mountain Bistro because Idaho Peak was the 14th mountain that I had hiked from Vancouver Island.
She says it suits her skills and personality. She enjoys meeting people who have family connections to Sandon, and she thinks about those who lived here over a century ago.
And I was just marveled by this and the tenacity that it took people and the drive and ambition and focus to get into this valley. And because I knew just walking, I was following trails that were already pre-me. And these people were plowing through and building trails all by hand. There was no machines, and wanted to be part of this, not just to make this as a lifestyle. I also saw the opportunity to do something here and to share this world with everybody and to share this history.
Not far from Sandon is another ghost town, Zinkton. The mines last operated there in the 1950s, and some buildings stood until the 80s. But Zinkton may be coming back, in name at least, if a local entrepreneur's dream is successful.
Hi, I'm David Harley. Zinkton is a project in the Valley of the Ghosts that will blend the best of what was and the best of what will become.
Harley wants to build a ski village here.
Yeah, we're going to have a little village. We're going to have 6 lifts. We're going to have a tremendously large backcountry powder accessible ski area. And it snows a lot in Goat Pass. And yeah, that's the dream, someplace where you can ski all day and come down and to a small village and have pizza and beer and tell stories.
As part of his plan, he also wants to clean up some of the negative environmental legacies of mining in the region. Now, Harley's plan isn't without its detractors. The Ktunaxa First Nation is concerned it could threaten the habitat of grizzly bears, wolverines, and other species. The Sinaiaks Confederacy is calling for a formal environmental assessment. Others question the project's economics. For now, Harley's dream is in the hands of the provincial government, which is reviewing his proposal. We'll leave the final word with him.
As an enterprise guy, our vision is to use enterprise to create and turn a negative into a positive and use the remediation that we're planning to perform as a reason to come and visit, as a reason to come and ski at Zinkton.
No matter the outcome, the Kootenays and its spirit for adventurous industry will always thrive. And that's our podcast on ghost towns. Thanks to our reporter for this episode, Greg Nesteroff. For more stories on the incredible history of our region, or to check out episodes from Season 1 and Season 2 of the Headwaters, head over to our website, headwaterspodcast.com. The Headwaters is created by the good folks at Kootenay Mountain Culture Productions and brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. To find out more about all the good things the Trust does when it comes to supporting people and communities in the Columbia Basin, visit ourtrust.org. I'm Mitchell Scott. Thanks for listening.